Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, November the 5th. We are starting our final unit of study in this quarter, and in these 4 weeks, our study theme will be the King of the Jews. During this quarter, we've looked at Jesus as prophet, and then the past 4 weeks, Jesus as priest, and in these final 4 weeks of this quarter, Jesus as king. Generally speaking, we as a nation don't like kings. We had a king once and didn't really care for it. And so when many of us hear the word king, a couple of images typically come to mind. The first, that of a distant tyrant across the ocean who mistreats the people, taxes unfairly, those kind of things. Second image is that of a kind of a figurehead, a meaningless person who's installed as a figurehead, a historical office that's held over from the past but doesn't have any real power. So we need to understand that when we speak of Jesus Christ as our king, we're not alluding to either a tyrant or a figurehead or even a benevolent king that serves for a season. We're instead speaking of a perfect, righteous, and loving king, one who's absolutely sovereign in his authority and who is eternal in his reign. In both the Old and New Testament, we find explicit references to Jesus, the Messiah, as being a king. Micah 5:2, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, are only a small village among all the people of Judah, yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are in the distant past, will come from you on my behalf." Jeremiah 23:5, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land." Zechariah 9:9, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." You may remember just a few weeks ago we studied about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, where he fulfilled that prophecy from Zechariah. The angel Gabriel, when he announced to Mary that she was going to give birth to Jesus, said in Luke 1:32 and 33, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end." Paul in Ephesians 1:19 through 22 says, "I pray that you'll understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe in him. This is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. Now he is far above any ruler or authority or power or leader or anything else, not only in this world, but also in the world to come. God has put all things under the authority of Christ and has made him head over all things for the benefit of the church. And the church is his body. It's made full and complete by Christ, who fills all things everywhere with himself." So we have a king, and his name is Jesus, and he's not just a king, but the king. The King of Kings with authority and dominion over all things. Understand that he's not simply a king in the sense that we normally use the term. When Jesus exited the tomb, he was resurrected as the king who holds the power over sin and death. No wonder that Paul said in 1 Timothy 1:17, "Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, to God who alone is wise, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. So this week we start with a lesson that's entitled The Accused King. Jesus was arrested, tried, and condemned to die, even though he did no wrong. As we'll see, as we look at 22nd chapter of Luke and the last few verses, and then the first 25 verses in the 23rd chapter of Luke. You may remember that 2 weeks ago we studied how Jesus was betrayed and arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. So starting from that point in Luke's account, we'll pick up the narrative here. In Luke 22:54, it tells us that having arrested Jesus, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. And then we kind of have to look to John's account to fill in some of the blanks here. In John 18:12, it says that when this detachment of troops arrested Jesus and bound him, they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So the first place Jesus went was to Annas, who had been the high priest from 7 A.D. to 14 A.D. And he was deposed at that point by the Romans. And then his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was appointed in A.D. 18 as the high priest and served to A.D. 37. So he's officially the high priest. But there's a sense in which the high priests were a lifetime position. And so Annas still had power. And so they took him first to him. And now, when we go back to Luke's account in Luke 22:55, now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But Peter denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." We go back to John 18. It tells us that after Jesus met with Annas, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. That's right after Peter denied Jesus for the first time. And then as we pick up the narrative, after a little while, another person saw Peter and said, you also are of them. But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." Now in John's account, it tells us that this last one was a relative of Malchus, whose ear Peter had cut off in the garden. But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're saying." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And so Peter went out and wept bitterly. So we see here the fulfillment of what Jesus had said just a few hours before to his disciples. We've seen how they deserted him when Jesus was arrested, and now Peter has denied him just like Jesus said he would. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him and blindfolded him. They struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. So that brings us up to where our lesson material begins in your daily discipleship guide, verse 66. So let's read verses 66 through 71. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, "If you're the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter, the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. And then they all said, are you then the Son of God? And so he said to them, you rightly say that I am. And they said, what further testimony do we need? For we've heard it ourselves from his own mouth. So, as we've already seen, Luke has told us that Jesus was arrested during the night. And he was, as we've seen, he went to Annas first, and then late in the night, towards early morning, he was taken to Caiaphas. And so at daybreak, as Luke tells us here, he went before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin here is convened to hear the charges against Jesus. This is the first time Luke mentions the Sanhedrin, although he's referred to it on several occasions when he's used phrases like the chief priests, the elders, scribes, teachers of the law. We've talked before, but just quickly to review, the Sanhedrin was the supreme governing body of the Jews. It was made up of 71 men who were primarily priests and other aristocratic leaders of the people. It's mainly made up of Sadducees, who were the Jewish aristocrats, but there are some Pharisees among them as well. The Sanhedrin had very broad powers over the Jewish people, but they were limited by what the provincial governor, who answered to the emperor, allowed them here. The general rule was that this body did not have the right to inflict the death penalty. And so that seems to be the case in this particular instance, and that drives some of the things that we're going to see happen. And also, it was generally believed that the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, couldn't vote on capital offenses at night. So they had to have this assembly as quickly as they could after daybreak here. So that helps to explain this early morning meeting of the Sanhedrin. And so the question they put to Jesus here, if you're the Christ, if you're the Messiah, tell us. And that's what they want to get him to admit, to claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus has offered lots of hints in the previous months that he is, but he has not made that explicit claim. And when Jesus answers, you will not, if I tell you, you will by no means believe, he's saying that they're not really asking in order to find out whether or not he's the Messiah. They're not really interested in that. They only want to use the answer he gives them to condemn him. And then he goes ahead to say, if I ask you, you would not answer. And similarly, that reminds them that they're not interested in any discussion to get at the truth, but they're only asking the questions. They're only having this trial to pronounce judgment, to condemn him. And so he goes ahead to say then, refusing to give them the answer they want, he just says, hereafter the Son of Man will sit the right hand of the power of God. Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen. And he tells them the end result of the coming events. He's going to be exalted to a higher position than any they envision for the Messiah. And from there, he will reign. So here he kind of combines allusions to Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And then Daniel 7:13, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And both of these, he's already made reference in the past to help to explain what his role is. So here, he just explains to them what's going to happen as a result of the events that are about to unfold. Even though they don't understand what Jesus means, they do understand him to say that he is somehow God's special representative. And so they ask him then the question, are you then the Son of God? And so that's probably carries the idea of being some form of blasphemy. Are you then the Son of God? And only Luke records this direct question here, are you the Son of God? And the Lord's direct answer, which literally says, you say that I am. Now, when Jesus says that, he doesn't quite mean you're right, because their understanding, their conception is wrong. So, even though the title is correct, and Jesus knows this is all a part of the plan of God, you say that I am here. So the answer is a qualified yes, and for them, that's all that they need. They've heard it from his own lips. He has claimed to be the Son of God. So the religious part of the trial is over here in these verses. The next step is to take him to the Roman authorities who have the power, the authority to pronounce the sentence that they want, to condemn Jesus to death. The Son of God was to be crucified, and only the Romans could do that. Referring to the Jewish authorities, William Stalker wrote in The Trial and Death of Jesus Christ, it may be said that they walked according to their light, but the light that was in them was darkness. Matthew Henry, the noted Bible commentator, said there's none so blind as those that will not see. And that's pretty descriptive of these Jewish leaders right at this point in time. Luke 23, verses 1 through 5. The whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And then Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, it is as you say. And so Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no fault in this man. John 18:28 tells us that Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning, and then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. When they got there, his accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, what's your charge against this man? So what's going on here, as we've already alluded to, the Sanhedrin didn't have the right to inflict capital punishment. Only the governor, who at that time was Pontius Pilate, had that right. Pontius Pilate was appointed as the governor of the Roman provinces of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea in 26 AD. And the typical term for a Roman governor in that time was 1 to 3 years, but Pilate held his post for 10 years. He had a lot of power as the governor of this area. The power of a supreme judge. So he had the sole authority to order a criminal's execution. Now, he had other duties like collecting taxes and managing construction projects and all that, but one of his crucial responsibilities was maintaining law and order, and that helps to explain why he was in Jerusalem at this point in time. His residence was in Caesarea, but he was in Jerusalem because of the Passover. He wasn't Jewish, but he needed to be present there because there was a lot of potential for trouble. Passover was the time for various pretenders to be the Messiah and revolts against Rome, and it was best for the governor to be nearby so that these kind of disturbances could be quickly handled. Now, we should also understand that the Jewish leaders did not like Pilate at all, and Pilate didn't like the Jewish leaders at all. There's a lot of hostility and animosity between these two. But the Jewish leaders have come to Pilate because he's the only one who has the authority to pronounce a capital sentence on Jesus. So in verse 2, they responded to Pilate's request his asking them why they're there. And they began to accuse Jesus. And there are 3 accusations that they make here in verse 2. One's a subjective opinion, one's a false charge, and one's a half-truth. So they kind of runs the spectrum here. The opinion is that Jesus is subverting the nation. A charge, in their opinion, Jesus is challenging the religious truths on which the Jewish culture was based. And it would seem Pilate wouldn't have a lot of concern for that. And so second, they falsely accuse Jesus to be a political revolutionary, saying he counseled people not to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, we know that's false because Luke records in chapter 20, verses 20 through 26, how that Jesus told in response to a question, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. So he very clearly supported paying taxes to Caesar. The half-truth is that Jesus does claim to be Christ and that he is, in a sense, a king. But the implication in that for the Sanhedrin is that Jesus has political ambitions and he's a rival to the emperor. And it's also clear here that the word Christ or Messiah was deliberately used by these Jewish leaders here to imply to Pilate that Jesus was a political activist and a threat to Roman sovereignty. So that accusation got Pilate's interest, and Pilate responded by asking him a direct question, are you the King of the Jews? Now, Pilate's question there is found in all 4 Gospels. Jesus' answer is the same in all 4 Gospels. The answer is slightly ambiguous, probably means something like, yes, I am the King of the Jews, but not in the sense that you understand the word king. But as we'll see, that answer is the basis for the charge for which Jesus is crucified. And notice above him on the cross we'll read the King of the Jews. It's also clear from this passage that Pilate very quickly understands that Jesus is not a threat. Verse 4 says that Pilate said to the chief priests of the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." Now, clearly, Luke is not recording everything that's said here. This is not a verbatim transcript of this trial. And so we don't know exactly what it was that led Pilate to conclude that Jesus was not dangerous, but he did. He announced very plainly, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." And it's important because Luke, in his gospel, he is very much interested in portraying Jesus as innocent in the Gospel of Luke and also in the book of Acts. Here, it's important to Luke for his readers to understand that Jesus is completely innocent of the charges that are made against him. The people who are confronting Jesus, who brought him to Pilate here, were intense in their opposition, and they were unwilling to back away here, and so they make it difficult for Pilate to release Jesus, as he would clearly like to do. On the one hand, Pilate doesn't have to listen to him. He has the authority. He's the governor, and he can make the decision. But on the other hand, these people have some power. He doesn't want to irritate them too much. They can make his job more difficult, and they can also make an appeal and complain to the emperor, which could lead to problems for Pilate. So they continue to press the issue, saying he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. So the scope of what they're charging Jesus with here is all over Judea, the whole land of the Jews, not just the province of Judea, but includes the area of Galilee. That reference to Galilee remind Pilate that he might have an out here. And Luke records in verses 6 through 12 how Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. Luke's the only one that records this part of the story. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now, this is Herod Antipas. He's the son of Herod the Great, who had all the babies killed when Jesus was born there. This is the same Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded. And it's also the Herod that Jesus called that fox back in Luke 13. When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see a miracle done by him. And then he questioned him with many words, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him, and then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. So Luke here tells us that Herod had been wanting to see Jesus for a long time. He particularly wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle. When Jesus didn't perform a miracle, or he didn't even answer his questions, Herod mocked him and then sent him back to Pilate. Luke then makes the very interesting comment that this encounter caused Herod and Pilate to patch up their differences. He doesn't give an explanation for their former enmity, but he notes that Herod and Pilate became friends. Now, his statement may be intended to be ironic here in the sense that two of the most wicked rulers of the first century agree that Jesus is innocent. And their discussion brings them to become friends, but they're unwilling to do what's right. They are mentioned together again in Acts 4, 26 and 27, where their actions are condemned. So it's a very interesting encounter here as Jesus goes before Herod. But as we've heard in the verse just read here, Herod wanted nothing to do with what's going on, and so he sent him back to Pilate. Picking up our reading in verse 13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You brought the man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. And neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. And indeed, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast." And they all cried out at once, saying, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder." And Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. So when Jesus is returned to Pilate, back in verse 13, Pilate called again the chief priests, the rulers, and this crowd of people together. And clearly he's trying to find some way out of his dilemma. He doesn't want to condemn Jesus. He believes him to be innocent, but he also doesn't want to risk the wrath of the crowd. And so he says to them in verse 14 and 15, "You brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and I've examined that charge, and I don't find any validity to it. I find no fault in this man concerning the things that you accuse him of, and neither did Herod, because Herod examined him and sent him back to me. And indeed, he says, he has not done anything that's deserving of death." And so his proposal here in verse 16, "I will punish him and then release him." And then Luke records for us in verse 17, "For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast." And what he doesn't explain what he's talking about there. If we look back in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 6, it tells us, "Now at the feast he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels, they had committed murder in the rebellion. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" And so that's what Pilate's proposing. I'll punish him and then I'll release him. He'll be the one that I release, as I always do. Their response is vehement here. They're enraged. And they cried at once, saying, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas." They demanded the death of Jesus and the release of Barabbas, who's clearly a criminal, notorious criminal, who's been thrown into prison for leading a rebellion and for murder. In a kind of a mob-like mentality, they cry out, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas." We see in this account here the first clear mention of the people in a negative light in Luke's account. Up to this point, they've generally been supportive of Jesus, but now clearly they've been swayed by the chief priests and the rulers, and they've, like I say, they've kind of become a mob here. Luke is very clear, and he wants the reader to understand that Barabbas was truly guilty of that for which Jesus is being condemned. He was guilty of insurrection. He was guilty of murder. And so in this, perhaps we see most clearly the false motives of Jesus' accuser. They would rather have a murderer released than this one who they know to be innocent. Well, Pilate clearly does not want to condemn Jesus. Verse 20 tells us that he wished to release Jesus here. But he's unwilling. He has not the courage, it seems, to take the steps that's necessary to do that. So in verse 20, he again proposes to release Jesus. But the crowd shouts all the more vehemently here, "Crucify him, crucify him." And the third time, Pilate says to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. Let me just punish him and let him go." But they were insistent, and they demanded with loud voices that he be crucified. And then Luke tells us at the end of verse 23 and verse 24 that their insistence, their vehemence prevailed here. Perhaps his fear of a riot. Notice Pilate never agrees with their accusation of Jesus. But his fear of a riot or his dread of their political power leads him to grant their demand. And so verse 24 tells us that Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. Pilate finally had to make a decision. And as one commentator pointed out, every person they come to the place in their life where they have to make the decision about Jesus Christ, whether to trust him or whether to reject him. Pilate here rejects him and passes sentence. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Matthew records the very familiar story. Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing, so he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And the people said, "We'll take the responsibility. We're glad to here." So Pilate was a compromiser who was willing to content the people or pacify the crowd, as some translations say. Barabbas was released. Jesus was condemned to die on the Roman cross. Pilate was a complex character. He openly said that Jesus was innocent, but he permitted him to be beaten and condemned him to die. He carefully questioned Jesus, even trembled at his answers, but the truth of the word didn't make a difference in his decision. He wanted to be popular and not right. He was more concerned about reputation than character. So what do we need to take away from our lesson this week? Jesus was condemned to die even though he was completely innocent. Because of that, he became the perfect substitute or atoning sacrifice to provide forgiveness for our sins. The only completely sinless one was treated unfairly, and yet he obediently endured the mistreatment, the scorn, the hostility from those he came to save. We're reminded of the prophecy in Isaiah 53. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we're healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed. He was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. In complete fulfillment of prophecy and the will of God, Jesus willingly endured the deceit, the injustice, and the abuse that led to his death. As we understand that and accept and embrace the unparalleled sacrifice of the King of the Jews, we can experience the mercy and grace of God for all eternity. Praise be to God for his salvation. Next week, come back and we'll continue in Luke 23 with a lesson about the crucified King. Thank you.